Naomi Brooks stood outside the ballroom doors, in a dress she had bought with her own money, unaware that in a matter of minutes her husband would look her in the eye and tell her she did not belong there. She had flown back early from a business trip in Chicago to surprise him, carrying nothing but a small overnight bag and a quiet hope that the weekend might feel, for once, like an ordinary marriage. Instead, she found herself standing in the marble lobby of one of Manhattan's most expensive hotels, watching waiters carry trays of champagne toward a ballroom glowing with candlelight. She assumed at first that she had wandered into someone else's celebration, a stranger's joy that had nothing to do with her. Then she saw the name printed in gold script on the welcome placard by the entrance, and the world around her seemed to slow to something almost unbearable. The groom's name read Ethan Walker, her husband's name. For a moment, Naomi convinced herself it had to be a coincidence, a shared name, a trick of exhaustion after a 6-hour flight. She stepped closer to the doors, her heels silent against the carpet, and that was when Ethan turned and saw her standing there, in her navy dress, her hair still pinned from the plane ride, her face open with the last innocent question she would ever ask him. He did not run to her. He did not look afraid. He simply straightened his jacket, glanced toward the security guard standing near the entrance, and said the 5 words that would end 14 years of marriage in front of a room full of strangers. "You are not invited." His voice was flat, almost bored, as though she were an uninvited caterer rather than the woman whose name was still on the deed to their house. The guests nearest the door turned to look at her the way people look at an unfamiliar face at a private event, with polite confusion edging toward suspicion. And Naomi realized in that instant that every person in that ballroom believed she was the one who did not belong. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. Naomi Brooks had spent 17 years building a career in corporate finance by staying calm when other people panicked, and something in her simply clicked into that same cold, careful gear now. She stepped back from the doorway, her heart pounding in a rhythm she refused to let show on her face, and pulled out her phone to check the calendar entry Ethan had given her only 4 days earlier. Corporate law conference, out of state, he had told her, apologizing in advance for missing her sister's birthday dinner. There was no conference. There had only ever been this. As she stood in the hallway, a bridesmaid in champagne-colored silk walked past her, laughing about the bride's dress fitting that morning. And Naomi understood with sudden, sickening clarity that a woman she had never met was, at that very moment, becoming Mrs. Walker in a ceremony her own husband had orchestrated with meticulous care. The lobby lights suddenly felt too bright, the string quartet music drifting from the ballroom too cheerful, the whole scene arranged like a stage set for a life Naomi had never been told was ending. She thought of the mortgage payments she had made from her own account for the past 9 years, the tuition she had quietly paid off from Ethan's law school loans before they married, the countless nights she had come home from the office to find him already asleep, never once suspecting that the marriage he complained was cold was, to him, simply a formality he had already begun to discard. A part of her wanted to walk into that ballroom and demand an explanation in front of everyone. But a colder, more practical part of her, the part that had spent a career reading balance sheets for the lies hidden inside them, told her to wait. She turned instead toward the hotel's business center, needing somewhere quiet to think, and it was there, scrolling through her banking app out of pure reflexive habit, that the second shock of the evening arrived. Notifications began stacking on her screen one after another, each one a small detonation. $28,000 to a vendor called Cole Event Design, $14,000 to a jewelry boutique on Fifth Avenue, $52,000 charged directly to the hotel's events division, $18,000 for what the receipt described only as private orchestra services. Naomi stared at the numbers until they blurred, her thumb frozen above the screen, because every single charge had been drawn from her own corporate premium credit card, the one tied to her executive account at the bank, the one she rarely used because her salary as chief financial officer of a major logistics corporation made it, in practice, unnecessary for daily life. She had given Ethan authorized access to that card 2 years earlier, after he asked, almost sheepishly, if he could use it to put down a deposit on a surprise anniversary trip. She remembered trusting him instantly, the way she always had, because trust had never before cost her anything she could not afford to lose. Sitting alone in the sterile light of the business center, Naomi began scrolling backward through months of statements she had never thought to examine closely, assuming her financial team handled the routine oversight the way they always did. She found charges for tailored suits she did not recognize. Hotel stays in cities Ethan claimed were work trips, a payment to a private stylist, another to a florist, and finally, 3 days earlier, a single charge of $9,000 for what the receipt simply labeled as bridal alterations. Her hands did not shake, her breathing did not quicken. She had learned long ago in boardrooms full of men who expected her to fall apart under pressure that the most dangerous version of herself was the one who stayed perfectly still. She picked up her phone, dialed her bank's private client line, and waited, watching through the glass wall as more guests arrived in the lobby, laughing, unaware that the celebration they were walking toward had already begun quietly collapsing from the inside. She thought, too, of the countless small compromises she had made over the years without ever framing them as sacrifices, the vacations she had shortened to accommodate his trial schedules, the promotions she had quietly delayed discussing at dinner so as not to overshadow whatever small victory he had brought home from the office that week. None of it had felt like a burden at the time, because Naomi had always believed a marriage functioned like a well-managed portfolio, requiring patience, reinvestment, and faith that the returns would eventually balance out across the years rather than in any single quarter. Sitting now in the sterile light of the business center, she understood for the first time that she had been the only one making deposits into an account someone else had been steadily emptying behind her back. It was not rage that rose in her chest at that realization, though rage would have been simpler and perhaps even more comfortable. It was something closer to recalibration, the same feeling she experienced when a spreadsheet finally revealed the error that had been quietly distorting every number above it for months. The private banking line connected her almost immediately, a benefit of the account tier she had earned through more than a decade of loyalty and seven-figure balances. A calm, male voice confirmed her identity through a series of security questions, and when Naomi asked whether her husband still held authorized access to the card in question, the answer came back exactly as she feared. Yes, Mrs. Brooks, your husband is listed as an authorized user on this account, effective for the past 26 months. She asked the representative to read back the most recent transactions, and as he did, in the same neutral tone one might use to recite a grocery list, Naomi understood that the wedding happening one floor above her was being paid for entirely with money she had earned. Every centerpiece, every violin, every diamond glinting on a stranger's finger, all of it running through an account with her name printed at the top. She thanked the representative, and then, in a voice as steady as a closing argument, she asked him to freeze the entire credit line, effective immediately, no exceptions, no further authorizations of any kind. The representative hesitated only slightly before confirming the request, noting that a formal fraud flag would also be applied given the unusual volume and pattern of the charges, and that the bank's internal compliance team would likely follow up directly given the size of the account. Naomi ended the call and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the business center, the muffled sound of a toast being given somewhere above her, drifting faintly through the walls. She felt something settle inside her chest. Not yet grief, not yet fury, but the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent their careers making decisions under pressure. She was not going to scream. She was not going to cry in a hallway for strangers to photograph. She was going to do what she had always done best, which was to gather every fact, verify every number, and wait for the moment when the truth would present itself with no help required from her at all. Upstairs, Ethan Walker believed the evening was already won. He had seen Naomi's face for barely 3 seconds before she turned and walked away, and in his mind that brief, silent retreat was the end of the matter. A woman too proud and too controlled to make a scene, exactly as he had always counted on her to be. He returned to the ballroom feeling lighter than he had in months, slipping his arm around Vanessa Cole's waist as she adjusted the diamond bracelet he had given her. Only that morning, a bracelet purchased, though she did not know it, from an account that was not entirely his to spend from. Vanessa leaned close to his ear as the string quartet shifted into a new arrangement, her voice dripping with the kind of satisfaction that comes easily to people who have never had to build anything themselves. "Poor woman," she murmured. Glancing toward the doors Naomi had disappeared through, she really thought she still mattered. Ethan laughed, low and self-satisfied, and several of his groomsmen laughed along with him, raising their glasses in a toast to a marriage none of them yet understood was standing on a foundation about to give way entirely. Upstairs, none of the guests yet understood what had already begun unfolding one floor below them, and the ceremony continued exactly as planned, the officiant reading through introductory remarks about love and partnership to a room full of people who had no reason to doubt the sincerity of either. Ethan stood at the altar beside Vanessa, occasionally glancing toward the entrance out of some faint, unexamined instinct, though he told himself each time that the flicker of unease meant nothing at all. Vanessa, for her part, radiated the particular glow of a woman who believed she had won something rare, a successful attorney, a beautiful venue, a life assembled with the kind of polish she had spent years cultivating for an audience she imagined would always be watching. She had met Ethan 18 months earlier at a charity auction, drawn first to his confidence and later to the version of his life he described, one he always seemed careful to frame as entirely self-made. Neither of them had any reason yet to suspect that the woman who had just walked away in silence held, quite literally, the financial key to everything currently glittering around them. Naomi did not leave the hotel. She took a seat instead in a quiet corner of the lobby lounge, ordered a glass of water she had no intention of drinking, and opened her laptop with the same composure she brought to a hostile board meeting. Her first call was to Olivia Grant, the attorney who had handled every significant legal matter in Naomi's professional and personal life for the better part of a decade, a woman known throughout Manhattan's legal circles for her precision and her utter refusal to be rushed. Olivia listened without interrupting as Naomi laid out what she had discovered: the wedding, the charges, the authorized card access, that her voice never once cracking, even as she described watching her husband tell her she was not invited to her own marriage's undoing. When Naomi finished, Olivia's response was immediate and calm. "Do not confront them tonight," she said. "Gather everything quietly, the statements, the security footage if you can get it, any signed authorization documents, and then let them destroy themselves in front of every witness they invited." Naomi followed her attorney's instructions with the same discipline she applied to every audit she had ever overseen. She requested, through the hotel's guest services desk, a copy of any signage or booking confirmation associated with the Walker wedding, citing a billing discrepancy that needed urgent internal review, a request the staff processed without hesitation given her account status. She pulled digital copies of the card authorization form Ethan had signed 2 years earlier, the one that granted him access, but explicitly kept the account itself in her sole name and under her sole liability. She forwarded every relevant email and statement to Olivia's office within the hour, building, charge by charge, a record so complete that no court in the state would be able to argue the money had been anything but hers. Through the glass doors of the lounge, she could see the ballroom lights shifting to a warmer gold, could hear the faint rise of applause, as someone somewhere gave a toast, and she felt, for the first time that evening, a strange and unfamiliar calm settle over her, the calm of a woman who understood that the truth, once fully documented, rarely needed to be shouted to be devastating. Naomi's mind, even as she waited for Olivia's callback, confirming receipt of the documents, drifted briefly to the early years of her marriage, back when Ethan was still a junior associate, working long nights at a mid-sized firm, and she was the one carrying the greater share of their combined income without ever once making him feel diminished by it. She remembered celebrating his first major case win with a bottle of wine they could barely afford at the time, remembered believing, with the particular certainty of the young, that whatever gap existed between his ambitions and his achievements would close naturally as the years passed. It had not occurred to her, not once across 14 years, that the gap might instead widen quietly until it became a kind of resentment he never spoke aloud, a resentment that eventually curdled into the belief that he deserved a life grander, than the one they had built together honestly. She did not excuse what he had done by understanding where it may have come from. She simply noted it, filed it away the way she filed away every other relevant fact that evening, because understanding a betrayal and forgiving it were, she now knew with total certainty, two entirely separate exercises. It was nearly 9 in the evening when Marcus Reed, the bank's senior private client director, finally reviewed the fraud flag that had been automatically escalated to his desk. Marcus had managed Naomi's accounts personally for almost 6 years, and he recognized her name the instant it appeared on the alert, along with a pattern of transactions that troubled him far more than the dollar amounts alone. Charges totaling over $112,000 had been processed within a span of roughly 72 hours, concentrated almost entirely around wedding-related vendors, at a physical location far from Naomi's usual spending patterns, while the primary account holder herself had just personally disputed every single transaction by phone. Bank protocol in cases involving this scale of disputed activity required immediate verification directly with the authorized user before any further charges could be approved, and so Marcus picked up his phone and dialed the number listed for Ethan Walker, watching the call ring through without answer, once, then twice, then a third time, as the minutes ticked past 9:15. Inside the ballroom, the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone and announced, to warm applause, that it was time for the exchange of rings. Ethan stood at the altar beside Vanessa, his hand steady as he slid a platinum band onto her finger, utterly unaware that 11 floors below and several blocks across town, a man he had never met was 3 failed phone calls into an investigation that would end everything he believed he had just secured. Marcus tried Ethan's number a 4th time, then, following escalation protocol for accounts of this tier and this dispute severity, made the decision to attempt contact through the only other channel available to him, a general inquiry line the hotel's events coordinator had listed as an emergency contact for the Walker Cole wedding party. The officiant asked Ethan to repeat his vows. Ethan opened his mouth to speak the words he had rehearsed for weeks, and at that exact moment, from somewhere inside his jacket pocket, his phone began to ring, the sound cutting sharply through the hushed and reverent silence of the room. Ethan froze, his hand still holding Vanessa's, his eyes darting instinctively toward the pocket where the phone buzzed insistently against his chest. He tried to silence it discreetly, fumbling with the fabric, but the device slipped and clattered onto the polished floor, screen facing upward, glowing bright against the dim lighting of the altar. The words displayed across the screen were plain and unmistakable to anyone close enough to read them. Private banking. Several guests in the front rows exchanged glances, murmuring softly, while the officiant paused mid-sentence, uncertain whether to continue. Vanessa's smile faltered for the first time all evening, as she watched Ethan bend down, phone in hand, his composure cracking at the edges, in a way none of his 300 guests had ever seen before. He answered the call more out of panic than choice, perhaps hoping a quiet acknowledgement would end it quickly, never once suspecting that Marcus Reed's voice, precise and unhurried, was about to be heard by every microphone in the room. Marcus, unaware that his call had connected during the ceremony itself, began speaking the moment Ethan answered, his tone professional, measured, entirely unaware of the audience listening in. Mr. Walker, this is Marcus Reed, calling from the private client division. I need to ask you directly, can you explain the series of transactions made in the past 3 days using Mrs. Naomi Brooks' corporate premium account? The wireless lapel microphone clipped to Ethan's jacket, still switched on from the vows moments earlier, carried every word of the question through the ballroom's sound system with startling clarity. A stunned silence fell over the guests as the question hung in the air, repeating itself in the minds of everyone seated close enough to have heard it clearly the first time. Ethan stammered something inaudible, pressing the phone hard against his ear, as though he could somehow will the sound back into privacy, but the damage had already spread through the room like smoke through an open door. Marcus continued, his voice carrying that same even, procedural calm that made the words land with even greater weight. Mrs. Brooks has formally disputed every transaction associated with this account over the past 72 hours, and per our compliance policy, The account has been fully frozen effective immediately. The color drained visibly from Ethan's face, his hand tightening around the phone until his knuckles whitened, while beside him, Vanessa's expression shifted from confusion to dawning, horrified comprehension. Guests began whispering openly now, some pulling out their own phones, others simply staring in open disbelief at the groom who, moments earlier, had been exchanging sacred vows and was now standing frozen at the altar, receiving what was unmistakably a fraud notification. Marcus, still unaware of the scene his call had ignited, asked one final question before ending the conversation. "Mr. Walker, given the scale of these disputed charges, will you be available tomorrow morning to discuss repayment terms directly with Mrs. Brooks's legal representation?" The call ended, but the silence it left behind did not. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, his eyes lifting to meet the stunned faces of 300 guests who had just heard, in painfully clear audio, that the wedding they were attending had been financed through fraud, committed against his own wife. Vanessa yanked her hand away from his, her carefully composed bridal smile collapsing into something closer to panic, while whispers rippled outward from the front rows toward the back of the ballroom, like a wave gathering force. The officiant, uncertain what protocol existed for a moment such as this, simply stepped back from the altar entirely. Somewhere near the entrance, a hotel events coordinator's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the accounting department, informing her that the account attached to tonight's booking had just been flagged and frozen, meaning every remaining vendor payment scheduled for the evening would now fail to process. The celebration, in every sense that mattered, was already over. It simply had not stopped moving yet. Within minutes, the practical consequences began arriving one after another, each one a fresh and public humiliation. The hotel's event manager approached Ethan quietly at first, murmuring something about a payment processing issue, but as more vendors attempted to run final charges against a frozen account, the failures became impossible to keep discreet. The catering staff, mid-service with the main course, received word that the outstanding balance for the evening's food and beverage package had not cleared, and a supervisor was forced to pull several servers aside to explain that additional courses could not be released until payment was resolved. The string quartet, contracted for a full evening, including a late set, packed away their instruments after their coordinator confirmed the deposit for extended hours had bounced entirely. One by one, the carefully arranged pillars of the celebration began to wobble and fall, each collapse visible to a room full of guests who had, only an hour earlier, been raising champagne glasses in celebration. A representative from the jewelry boutique responsible for Vanessa's wedding band and matching earrings arrived at the ballroom entrance shortly after 10 in the evening, having been alerted by his own company's fraud department that the payment authorizing the pieces had just been reversed. He approached the head table with visible discomfort, apologizing repeatedly as he explained, in a hushed but audible voice, that company policy required the jewelry to be returned immediately pending resolution of the disputed charge. Vanessa's hands trembled as she unclasped the earrings, her face burning with humiliation in front of guests who, only hours earlier, had admired the pieces glittering under the ballroom lights. Several guests began quietly gathering their belongings, murmuring apologies about early flights or long drives home, though everyone in the room understood the true reason for their sudden departure. Phones were out everywhere now, some recording, some simply texting friends who had not attended, and within the hour, fragments of what had happened inside that ballroom were circulating far beyond the walls of the hotel. Vanessa turned on Ethan the moment the jewelry representative walked away, her voice sharp and low, but no longer bothering to hide her fury from the guests still seated nearby. "You told me the money was yours," she hissed. "You told me you had built this life on your own." Ethan tried to explain, his voice cracking under the weight of a night collapsing far faster than he could manage, insisting that everything would be resolved by morning, that it was simply a misunderstanding between accounts. Vanessa did not wait to hear the rest. She pulled off her second ring, the platinum band Ethan had slid onto her finger less than an hour before, and set it down on the table between them without another word. Around them, the remaining guests watched in silence, the string quartet's empty chairs and half-cleared plates forming a strange, quiet tableau of a celebration that had died in real time in front of everyone invited to witness its birth. It was into this scene, roughly 40 minutes after the phone call, that Naomi Brooks walked back through the ballroom doors. She had changed nothing about her appearance since the moment Ethan told her she was not invited, still wearing the same navy dress, her composure entirely unchanged, despite everything that had transpired in the hours between. She did not rush toward the altar. She did not raise her voice or search the room for her husband's face. She simply walked, with the same unhurried confidence she carried into any boardroom, toward the small raised platform where the officiant's podium still stood, and she picked up the microphone the wedding planner had left, resting against its stand. The room, already unsettled and thinned by departing guests, turned toward her almost as one, recognizing in an instant that the woman standing before them now was the very Mrs. Brooks whose name had echoed through Marcus Reed's phone call less than an hour earlier. Naomi did not shout. She did not cry. She held up her phone instead, the screen displaying a series of documents she had spent the last several hours compiling with quiet, methodical precision. "This is the card authorization form my husband signed 2 years ago," she said, her voice even and clear through the microphone, carrying easily to every corner of the room. "It confirms, in his own signature, that this account belongs to me alone, and that he was granted access only as a courtesy." She swiped to the next screen, displaying the bank statement Marcus had confirmed only hours before. Every charge for tonight's wedding, the venue, the jewelry, the orchestra, the dress worn by the woman standing at that altar, all of it was paid for with money I earned. The room fell utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of a server clearing plates from an abandoned table near the back. Vanessa, still standing at the altar in the dress purchased with Naomi's own money, opened her mouth as though to object, but no words came. Ethan took a half-step forward, his hand raised in some instinctive, useless attempt at damage control, but Naomi simply turned her gaze toward him, calm and unreadable, and continued speaking as though he had not moved at all. "I am not here to ruin anyone's evening," she said, "because it appears that has already been managed without my help. I am here because fraud committed against a corporate account of this size carries legal consequences well beyond a private disagreement between spouses." Somewhere near the back of the room, a guest lowered his phone slightly, having been recording the entire exchange, while others exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with something close to reluctant admiration for the composure of the woman who had just walked into her husband's affair and dismantled it with nothing but documentation and a steady voice. It was at that moment that Olivia Grant entered the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the same unhurried authority Naomi had shown moments before, a leather folder held firmly under one arm. She crossed the room without hesitation, stepping up beside Naomi and addressing Ethan directly, her voice carrying the particular chill of an attorney who has done this exact thing many times before and finds no satisfaction in it beyond the satisfaction of doing it correctly. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I am formally serving you with divorce papers on behalf of my client, along with a civil complaint for financial fraud and breach of fiduciary trust regarding the shared account in question." She extended the folder toward him, and when he did not immediately reach for it, she simply set it down on the nearest table, the sound of the papers landing against polished wood somehow louder than anything spoken all evening. Marcus Reed's confirmation arrived by email to Olivia's phone almost simultaneously, a formal notice stating that the bank's fraud division would be opening a full internal investigation into the pattern of transactions, given both the scale of the amounts involved and the corroborating documentation Naomi had already submitted. Olivia read the notice aloud for the benefit of everyone still present, her tone as neutral as if she were reading a weather report, and the words seemed to settle over the remaining guests, like a verdict already rendered. Vanessa, understanding at last that no amount of outrage would salvage the evening or the relationship it had been built upon, turned and walked out of the ballroom without another word, her heels echoing sharply against the floor, until the doors swung shut behind her. Ethan remained standing near the altar, alone now in every sense that mattered, watching the woman he had spent months planning to discard calmly finish the work of ending everything he had built on her money and her trust. He crossed the room toward her then, his composure entirely gone, and for the first time that evening his voice cracked with something that sounded almost like genuine desperation. "Naomi, please," he said. "We can figure this out. I never meant for it to go this far." Naomi looked at him for a long moment, and those who stood close enough later described her expression as neither cold nor cruel, simply finished, the look of a woman who had already done all the grieving she intended to do in the quiet of a hotel business center hours earlier. "I am not interested in figuring anything out with you," she said, and the words were not raised, not dramatic, simply final. Ethan sank slowly onto one of the abandoned chairs near the head table, his forehead in his hands, while around him, hotel staff began quietly clearing what remained of a celebration that would never be completed, and Naomi turned and walked out of the ballroom exactly the way she had walked in, without hurry, without tears, without looking back even once. In the days immediately following the wedding, the story of what had happened inside that ballroom traveled through the city's professional circles with a speed that surprised everyone, except perhaps Olivia, who had seen reputations collapse quickly before, but rarely, with such precise and self-inflicted timing. Colleagues at Ethan's firm whispered about it in break rooms, careful never to mention it directly to him, while acquaintances who had once envied his apparent success now found themselves quietly relieved they had never invested anything of their own alongside him. Naomi, by contrast, discovered that her composure that evening had earned her a strange new form of respect among people who had only ever known her as competent and reserved, a respect built not on sympathy, but on the simple, undeniable fact that she had handled utter betrayal with more grace than most people manage during minor inconveniences. She did not seek out this attention, and in truth found much of it faintly uncomfortable, preferring instead to focus her energy on the practical, unglamorous work of rebuilding her financial and legal standing, exactly as she would have approached any other major disruption to her carefully managed life. The consequences that followed arrived with a swiftness that surprised even Olivia, who had handled dozens of contentious separations over the course of her career, but rarely watched one collapse so publicly and so completely in a single night. By Monday morning, footage and second-hand accounts of the wedding had already reached Ethan's law firm through channels no one could quite trace, and by Tuesday afternoon, he received a formal notice placing him on immediate unpaid leave, pending an internal review of conduct unbecoming a senior partner. The firm's statement, delivered through a brief and carefully worded memo, cited concerns about financial impropriety and reputational risk to the firm's clients. Concerns that only deepened once the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee opened its own separate inquiry into the matter days later. Colleagues who had once sought Ethan out for lunch invitations and golf outings now avoided him in hallways, and within 2 weeks, the firm quietly finalized his termination, citing breach of professional conduct standards that made any future defense of his position effectively impossible. The vendors who had provided services for the wedding, having lost their promised payments when the account was frozen and the divorce proceedings began, filed their own claims directly against Ethan personally, since Naomi's legal team made clear through Olivia that her client bore no responsibility for debts incurred fraudulently in her name. The venue alone pursued him for the outstanding balance on catering and staffing costs, while the jewelry boutique, orchestra, and florist each filed smaller but still substantial claims of their own. Ethan, stripped of his position and facing mounting personal debt with no income to offset it, began selling off the possessions that had once signaled his success, listing his luxury sedan within the first month and following it soon after with the watch he had worn to countless client meetings, a piece he had once described, without irony, as a symbol of everything he had worked to become. Even after liquidating what he could, the debts remained larger than what he was able to cover, a fact that followed him into every conversation with creditors who no longer cared what kind of lawyer he used to be. Vanessa Cole's departure from Ethan's life proved just as swift and just as public as everything else that had unraveled that night. Her online presence, built carefully over years around an image of curated luxury and effortless success, absorbed damage of its own. Once screenshots and secondhand accounts of the ceremony began circulating among people who recognized her name. She ended all contact with Ethan within days of the wedding, her representatives issuing a brief statement, distancing her entirely from what they described as a private matter involving another party's undisclosed financial obligations. The friends who had once toasted the couple's engagement at rooftop parties and quiet dinners quietly stopped returning Ethan's calls, understanding without needing to be told that association with him now carried a cost none of them were willing to pay. Within a single month, the man who had stood at an altar believing himself the architect of a new and better life found himself instead entirely alone, his career gone, his reputation in ruins, and the woman he had left, everything for nowhere to be found. The weeks between the wedding and the final settlement were, for Naomi, a quiet exercise in restoration rather than revenge, a distinction she held on to carefully. Whenever friends or colleagues asked whether she felt satisfied watching Ethan's life unravel so publicly, she spent her evenings not celebrating his losses, but simply returning to the routines that had always grounded her: morning runs along the river, dinners with her sister, long hours reviewing quarterly projections for the division she now oversaw. Olivia handled the legal proceedings with the same unhurried thoroughness she had shown from the very first phone call, ensuring that every dollar fraudulently spent was accounted for, and that Naomi's name was fully protected from any residual liability tied to the debts Ethan had left scattered behind him. There were moments, late at night, when Naomi allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been lost. Not the money, which had always been replaceable, but the 14 years she had spent believing in a partnership that had apparently stopped being mutual long before she noticed. She let herself grieve that loss honestly, without rushing past it, understanding that healing required acknowledgement rather than avoidance. And by the time the settlement was finalized, she found she had already done most of that grieving in private, long before the paperwork ever caught up. 1 month after that autumn evening, Naomi Brooks sat in a downtown conference room signing the final documents that closed out her divorce. Olivia Grant, seated beside her, reviewing each page with the same careful precision that had guided every step of the process from its very first hour. The settlement restored to Naomi every dollar that had been fraudulently charged against her account, along with additional damages awarded to cover legal fees and the reputational costs of a scandal she had never sought to create. Her company's board of directors, rather than viewing the very public unraveling as a liability, had instead watched her handle the entire situation with such composure and precision that they moved, within weeks, to expand her role, appointing her to a newly created executive position, overseeing the corporation's entire North American operations division. The promotion came with a substantial increase in both compensation and authority, a recognition not simply of her financial expertise, but of the steady, unshakable judgment she had demonstrated when everything around her had been designed to make her fall apart. On the evening of her formal appointment, Naomi attended a business gala hosted at a hotel not far from the one where her marriage had ended, dressed once again in a gown she had purchased with her own money, though this time she wore no wedding ring at all, having removed it the same week her divorce was finalized. She moved through the room with an ease that drew quiet attention from other executives and colleagues, not because of any scandal that had once surrounded her name, but because of the calm, deliberate confidence she carried into every conversation, the same quality that had once made her one of the most respected chief financial officers in the logistics industry and now made her something more. Several colleagues raised their glasses to her that evening, offering congratulations on the new role, and Naomi accepted each one with a genuine warmth that had nothing forced or performed about it. She had spent months rebuilding not her life, which had never truly needed rebuilding, but simply the space around it, clearing away everything that had once obscured how solid her foundation had always been. Across the city that same evening, in a modest one-bedroom apartment far smaller than the home he had once shared with Naomi, Ethan Walker sat alone, scrolling through a business news article on his phone, one that featured, prominently, a photograph of Naomi Brooks accepting recognition as one of the logistics industry's most accomplished female executives of the year. He read the article twice, studying the photograph of her smiling confidently beside colleagues who clearly respected her, and something in his chest tightened with a feeling he had spent most of his adult life avoiding, the particular ache of recognizing a loss too late to undo. He thought back to the early years of their marriage, before ambition and vanity had convinced him that a woman who quietly supported his career was somehow less impressive than one who could be photographed beside him at galas, and he understood, sitting alone in an apartment, furnished with the leftovers of a life that no longer fit him, that he had mistaken quiet strength for weakness and paid the entire cost of that mistake at once. The money had never been the true measure of what he lost, though the money itself had certainly cost him everything material he once valued: his career, his reputation, the possessions he had collected as evidence of a success he never actually earned on his own. What he understood now, far too late to matter, was that he had discarded the one person who had believed in him without condition, who had built the foundation beneath his entire career while asking for nothing beyond basic honesty in return, and he had thrown that trust away for the fleeting satisfaction of being seen as something grander than he actually was. Naomi Brooks, meanwhile, stood on the balcony of the hotel hosting her gala, a glass of wine in hand, looking out over the lit skyline of a city that had watched her lose everything in a single autumn evening, and then, within a month, rebuild something sturdier and more entirely her own than anything she had shared with him. She did not smile because she had won some contest against Ethan or Vanessa, because in truth she had never entered one. She smiled because she recognized, standing there in the crisp autumn air with the city spread out glittering below her, that she had reclaimed something far more valuable than money or reputation: the simple, uncomplicated right to trust her own judgment again. Betrayal, she understood now, with a clarity that no amount of anger could have given her, had the power to shatter faith in a single terrible instant, the way a single phone call ringing through a ballroom microphone could unravel months of careful deception in front of hundreds of witnesses. But dignity, she had learned, worked differently than trust, because dignity could not be stolen so easily, and independence, once reclaimed, opened doors no marriage built on lies could ever have offered her. Behind her, the doors to the gala closed softly, sealing away one more chapter of a life that had finally, fully, become entirely her own.